find yourself a booth, order up a cold one. This is the Spring Roll.
Hey everybody, welcome back to part 2 of our episode with Carl Rosen. Unfortunately, I will not be part of this conversation, but that's just better for Joe, because now he gets Carl all to himself. We hope you enjoyed his conclusion to what has been a very insightful conversation into the lost era of Bulova. And now, Joe, Carl, you may continue.
Hey! So now that I have you all to myself, the thing that Mike and I talk about a lot, and it has to do with just this level of scholarship and the ability or for us to know what Bulova had done and what Bulova, and it's always, we call it hashtag Bulova, just because the information is not there. My Bulova is a fantastic resource. It is a resource that I have used forever and ever. However, if I'm going to call them out specifically, if we talk about the Oceanographer G, classic Bulova model from the 1968 going into 1974, black dial, proud sticking up Lexan markers. I have cataloged myself personally. There are 9 different dial variations of that. However, my Bulova doesn't quite recognize that. And so we've had some arguments going on between Mike and I and the collector community within the My Bulova community, just saying these watches are not all the same. There are differences. And when you start looking at something like Rolex or Omega specifically, Omega Seamasters specifically, where dot over 90 versus dot not over 90 and all of these different iterations, Bulova doesn't seem to have quite the same scholarship that goes with that. And I think that has to do with the way that the collector community has been considering Bulova in slightly a different level, a different space. But when we start looking at the fact that this is a brand from 1875 and the history that goes with that, the innovation that goes with that. I mean, even the book, the coffee table book, The History of First, which I see behind you on the count, and I can look at mine from right here. Like, it does that, as you as the historian, does that affect you in any way?
Well, it challenges me because you've got to sort of dig in. I mean, Bulova was really the accessible luxury brand.
Yes.
Okay. So it was meant to put watches on people's wrists. It was the first full line of ladies' jewels wristwatches. The intent was to get the watches on people's hands. So I have to applaud Rolex for sort of sticking to the knitting and being very, very precise. But that was not the intent of Bulova. And even as a collectible, I doubt that Joseph or Artie Bulova thought that these would be collectible items. It sort of grew over time.
I mean, I have just purchased for my wife a original Rubaiyat on the silk strap, fixed lugs, and it's such a beautiful watch. And looking at that specifically, that particular part of history, that looking at, okay, we're going to dive deep into ladies' watches. We're going to push hard for that specifically, and using that as sort of a jumping off point. So, okay, men's wristwatches will come. It will come a little bit later. That level of innovation and looking forward, do you think that was a specific retail strategy, or was that looking at women as a market that was massively untapped and underserved?
Okay. My thoughts are Bulova started in 1875 as a jewelry company. They did not get into watches until the 1910s. So you have to think that most of that emphasis was for women. And to me, a lot of the detail, especially let's say in the Art Deco period, is something that women would focus on, that Bulova focused on as a jewelry company more than a watch company. So,
that's such a good point, though.
But when you look at Rubaiyat, think about it. 1917, is that the model year that you bought for your wife?
You know what? I don't think it's a 17. I think it's in the 20s.
Okay. So it came out in 1917, but it came out as a Rubaiyat. Joseph
Yes.
Bulova didn't think
no Bulova on the dial. Right. That's the version.
No, he didn't think that Bulova would be a brand. Think a jewelry store. A jewelry store typically, for many, many years, did not have brand on the
You're
jewelry.
you're selling other people's stuff. You're selling other manufacturers. It's not your
Or
own.
you're manufacturing yourself and you're selling a design. Today, you have the Marco Bichigos, you have the Roberta Coins, you have Tiffany. But for many, many years, when you go into a jewelry store and you would buy a 14, 18 karat gold item, it would be unbranded.
Yes.
So they use the name Rubaiyat. Now, do you know the what Rubaiyat really
Omar
is?
Khayyam. It's the poem.
Okay, so 12th century philosopher, poet, had the quatrain the of the Rubaiyat. And I'm thinking that was from like the 12th century. And so
Yeah.
you fast forward to the beginning of the 20th century, that's when those poems were translated to English and they became very popular. They were very like romantic poems and became very popular. But I'm also thinking maybe Bulova thought, gee, this guy, I don't have to pay royalties. He doesn't, he's not around anymore. And we'll use Rubaiyat, which is very well known, romantic, female. They even put Rubaiyat on the packaging of the
The
model.
packaging that I have seen from that is absolutely stunning. The fact that it just says Ruby out on the dial and there's no Bulova mention of it whatsoever. And the watch itself, like if we want to put it into perspective, the watch that my wife has is very much like a Cartier Pebble or anything. It's such a fantastic design. And looking at it, we have, so for my wife, I have this Rubaiyat. I also have a Miss America, different than the Miss Liberty, which is the reissue that has just been thrown out. And so this one is, it's a different set of jewels, but with the expansion bracelet. And the ladies' watches from that era are just so stunning. They're so good.
But besides stunning, they're to me innovative. So Bulova has almost 400 patents, even stud earrings, different jewelry executions, the dust cover for the movements. So there's a lot of
Yes.
Okay. So what I think is cool about that watch, it's a convertible watch, if it's the one I'm thinking about, like the one we have for 1917 with a satin strap. The reason it has a crown at the 12 o'clock is because it could be worn as a pendant, or it could be converted with a satin strap to be worn on the wrist. So it served two purposes.
It's so fascinating too that you're looking at the flexibility that Bulova was thinking about. But if we're talking about marketing specifically, because honestly, if we're looking at a company that is trying to make a profit, and you're looking at commerce doesn't fall far from the cut. So Joseph Bulova as a marketer, Joseph Bulova as a businessman, realizing that the women's market is untapped, realizing that if I'm starting to have a certain level of affluence, certain level of development, I will buy a watch for my wife just as something so I can show her off. And the aspect of the jewelry, but understanding the mechanical aspect of it from the men's perspective. From a marketing standpoint, it's like that's just a level of brilliance that you don't see going on hardly at all at that time period.
But to be honest, there's marketing brilliance, but there's also opportunity. So
Yes.
as the story goes, in I think 1909 or so, Bulova hired a clerk. His name was John Ballard, just to run around and do things within the store. Someone had bought some jewelry from Joseph Bulova and couldn't pay. And so what he did was barter some watches that he had to pay for the jewelry that he had bought. Okay. So this John Ballard, who I think was 14 years old when he was hired, said, let me try to sell those. And he did. And he did very quickly. And then Joseph Bulova realized that there was a market for watches.
Right. And that's something else.
So
And here we are today, 150 years later.
right. So, and that clerk, John Ballard, ultimately became president of Bulova for 30 years.
Of course, because that's the story. And if you talk about Bulova as the American dream, immigrant works with Tiffany, starts his own, hangs out his own shingle, and then creates a brand that here we are 150 years later, still within New York City. All of the things that go with that, with a museum currently within the Empire State Building. It's like, I don't know that you can get a better story, honestly. It's
No, and there's a number of brands. Actually, Tiffany's another one, which started back sort of in that same era. And actually in the 1950s, to turn things around, Bulova owned 30% of Bulova, I think in the mid 1950s.
And that's something else. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
Everything about the story, it's one of those weird unsung bits and pieces that maybe, okay, the advertising hasn't been there, maybe the information hasn't been there, but that's a huge part of your legacy as an employee of the company and now the historian. And I think that's something that we should really try to highlight, because I have known about you for a number of years. This is one of the first times that you and I have actually had the chance to talk, and I'm trying to get to New York so that I can go look in the museum. Not the displays. I need to see the drawers. I want to see the stuff I'm looking for that, because I understand enough of the history of the brand that I want to see the underneath, because I know what the highlights are. Yeah. Let's get into the nitty gritty.
Not many brands sort of have a historian, or sort of could qualify or feel committed that they want to continue that legacy. So for the 150 years of Bulova, we decided to commemorate and honor that legacy was we created a documentary, which is now available on Amazon Prime.
Amazon Prime, correct. So, which I have shamefully not seen yet, and I'm going to have to rectify that, much to my chagrin. But I will hold this out, that I was told that there would be a West Coast premiere and it would be in Los Angeles, and then it kept getting pushed. And currently, as we speak, it's happening in San Francisco, and I can unfortunately not attend because I need to speak with you, and I had a concert, and so there were impediments to me going to being at the West Coast premiere, and so I am.
Yeah. So unfortunately, actually, we had one planned, and then the whole wildfires, which is unfortunate for a lot of
correct. The wildfires got in the way, and that affected.
But our intent was we wanted to sort of put the show on the road and be able to spread the word, especially for new consumers who are not as familiar with the brand and the rich history. I mean, Bulova when you think about it, Bulova was the first company ever to advertise on television.
Completely, yes.
So that's amazing in itself. Bulova is the first company to advertise nationally on radio. That
runs on Bulova time. The United States, America runs on Bulova time. Yes.
Bulova was the first to create the clock radio in 1928. I mean, there's so many firsts and milestones, and their impact on the war effort and the U.S. military is
everything that goes along with that. And I think that there's a huge story to be told about the collaboration that went on between American brands, because Waltham, Benares, Bulova, and they were all using essentially a similar movement, which meant that there could, like, if your watch broke, you could replace it and just that level of cooperation with the war effort. But the Bulova A11s and I've had a few, and they're fantastic watches. The A17s going between World War II and Korea are also fantastic watches, and like you can't discount any of the things that go along with that.
The A11 is actually you Google it, you'll see it was the watch that won the war, because
correct
synchronized. And I think it was Bulova, Waltham, maybe Elgin.
Correct. Yeah, Elgin.
Were allowed to manufacture that. One interesting fact you'll see when you come to the museum is we have some of those watches, but it doesn't say Bulova on the dial.
No, it's a sterile dial.
Right. It says Bulova on the case back, and it has the purchase order number. Why? Because the branding was not important to the U.S.
No,
military. You don't want to distract. someone that's in a military operation for looking to see exactly what the time was. And
And
then
when you start looking at like that's the ORD or the ORD watches that we just needed to fix it. Your watch broke. I've got to fix it. It doesn't matter what I do. Your watch, because it's a functional piece of hardware for the war effort.
yeah, it was basically an issued item.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And the stories that go along with that. But then, like, if we want to delve into that specifically, and we were talking about AccuSwiss, I have the AccuSwiss reissue of the A15, which is the Navigator watch. It's the 3 crowns, 2 internal bezels,
Right.
which was not an issue piece. It was like a prototype piece, but Bulova as a company reissued, I think there are currently 4 different iterations of that in 2 different case sizes. But the thing that fascinates me is that the original was, I think, 33 millimeters. It was below 35. It's a tiny, tiny watch. And the one that I have, which is an AccuSwiss, is 40 millimeters. And the current issue that's in the catalog today, I think, is 42. And that watch just by itself is stunning. It's such a great design, legible from a distance, multiple functionalities within the same thing. And it's going for a navigator who's flying a mission from the UK over Germany and back. Where do I need to turn? When do I need to, and all the things go with it. Just looking at that level of functionality from an analog watch, from that point of view, like it's such a stunning design.
Yeah, actually, going the other way, what I think is interesting in the Accutron line in the 60s was the railroad watch.
I have one. I love it.
And it was one of the first wristwatches authorized by the railroads because of the accuracy. Before that, you had to take a pocket watch. But
it was pocket watch because of the larger balance and the larger amount of, yes.
Right. So that sort of revolutionized what the conductors would be able to wear and the accuracy. What's sort of fun to me is to look at the Canadian version, which was required to have a 0 instead of a 12.
Which is right on the dial, and it's the image right behind you, and that is the watch that I currently have. I have the 0 dial, the Canadian issue, and I love that watch so much. But the story for me for that watch, I received it as a quartz conversion.
Oh.
Because it had been returned to Bulova post 1980, and they were no longer supporting the tuning fork, so they put a quartz movement into it, and I had it restored to a tuning fork movement. But because of this placement of the date wheel, they had to clip off a bit of the dial so that the date could sit correctly.
Oh.
But now the date is recessed, and so you can see a little bit of the movement from the inside of my watch.
Yeah, it's tough because these watches that are so old, it's hard to keep manufacturing parts for it. And actually, even from a government standpoint, you can't have mercury cells.
No.
Yeah. So, there are people out there that are like Accutron doctors and people who sort of specialize in reconditioning these.
Mike and I have had this discussion, and you can probably speak to this as well, that there's a limited amount of stock. So if I've lost a coil, you're toast unless you can find a donor movement, and unless you can find their recreation of these movements or of these parts is few and far between.
Right.
So and it becomes a really interesting thing, because when you think about almost any other mechanical manufacturer, if I've got a lathe, I can probably recreate the part, but recreating an index wheel for an Accutron 218, 214
right.
movement.
The index wheel, there are 2 parts. One is the index wheel and the other is the coil. I mean,
yes.
The coil is something like 80 meters long.
Oh, God, yes.
Super thin. And it had to be manufactured on a continuous basis. No kinks, no bends, no breaks whatsoever. So Bulova actually back in the 60s couldn't find a manufacturer to do it, so they had to manufacture it themselves.
Yes.
So this, I think, I have an engineering background. what's interesting is apparently when they extruded the copper, they would have motors to, and would pull it through. But each one of the motors, I think there were like 7 over the length, had to run at a different speed because now it's thinner and thinner and thinner.
Right. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I think a guy named Charlie Souter was the engineer that came up with this configuration to be able to manufacture that.
Well, so there was the reissue though that came of the tuning fork movement, right? And it was for the I even forget which anniversary it was, the 100th anniversary, perhaps.
No, 50.
Okay, right. Thank you.
So Citizen, I was there at the time, and Citizen asked for the designs or technical information, and I actually still had a lot of vellum drawings, very large vellum drawings.
No.
For parts that were like tiny.
Yes, massively tiny.
So we made copies of these. We sent them off to them. I said, there is no way they're going to be able to pull this off. And they did because they're Citizen. So to me, it was an engineering marvel to create the movement to begin with, but it was equally amazing that they were able to redo it.
To recreate it.
To recreate it 50 years later.
In that fashion. And I've seen those watches. They come in the display case. The parts are, because I've spoken with repair guys, and their parts are 1-to-1. So the recreation is nearly perfect that I can use. But also it was a loss leader. There was, I mean, it didn't make a whole lot of money, but that kind of wasn't the point. Those watches, I would love to own one. Absolutely.
It was a real statement, and it was an homage, to the 50 years before. But I get requests all the time. People say, "Oh, why can't they go and make these index wheels or the coils?" And it's just so difficult to do.
Well, it's also because we've had discussions with current production, and it has to do with the fact that a lot of the technology, it's gone. There's no access to it. There's no ability to get past that. And it doesn't matter what you want. Like, who can extrude that kind of copper at scale? Right. Because those watches, particularly those reissues, were a limited edition. There weren't a whole lot of them made. There weren't a lot of them available. And all the problems that came with that. It's like, okay, it was not exactly a fool's errand, but close. It was going to be a loss leader. We were not making a lot of money off of these watches at the time.
So, but I would think that on some things, even like the index wheels, with 3D printing and technology today, you might be able to do those. The coils are sort of a different story. We did send a lot of our product and parts to the Veterans Watchmakers Initiative. So not only for training purposes, but they do repairs.
Yes.
Accutron down there, and we wanted to make it as easy as possible, for them to do it.
The part that's phenomenal to me, particularly when it comes to Accutron, that on the surface, the repair is not incredibly difficult. Like you mentioned, there's only 12 moving parts. However, you have to tool up, and everything has to be done under a microscope 400 times. So there's a level of expertise, and from my understanding, speaking on the forums and speaking to people who do Accutron repair, you've got to kind of know what you're doing, and you've had to have the experience. Like, regardless of what kind of microscope I have, I am not going to be able to do Accutron repair. Miyota repair, yes, probably. Accutron repair, probably not.
Right. No, the testing and the testing equipment is extremely important. I am not a watchmaker, but I did, the repair department did report to me, so I have a sensitivity to what needs to get done. I just don't know how to do it myself.
I feel like I am capable in many things. That is not my expertise, and I am more than happy to pay to have someone else manage my watches for me, because there's a fantastic story that Mike and I told. I had a watch that had a bent lug, and so I proceeded to bang on the lug with a bamboo hammer, and then I was looking at all of this weird glitter in the dial, because every numeral had come off and was sitting at the bottom of the dial. So then I had to go have that repaired and have some, and it's like, all right, I'm out. That was my last effort in watch repair. So moving on, now that I've completely exposed myself for the idiot that I am when it comes to watch repair. When we talk about case and dial manufacturer for Bulova,
Yep.
the Oceanographer G is a Singer dial, which is the same, it's a Rolex manufacturer. So, but how much of that was done in house? How much of that, like, where did Bulova move from completely in house to Bosch movements and Bosch cases and Bosch dials?
On the dials, we had our own dial department, but when I was there, it was for customization. So that we were very big in premium incentive, which now you call special markets, where an IBM, a Ford would want to give a service award for 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
Yes.
We would put that on the dial. We would do, NCAA championships. We would do
CIT. Yes. Yeah, you see those watches around all the time. Those are fantastic.
Right. So, but we even did things like the Virgin of Guadalupe was probably the most complicated, which was a pad printing process. But because it was 8 different colors for the Virgin of Guadalupe, it was a separate die for each color, and then a separate pad printing.
Yes.
One to the
wow.
other. We did that in Jackson Heights, that big Bulova building near LaGuardia Airport.
Right. That's now a commercial center.
Right. So we had a tremendous capability. But when I had to go out and buy dials, I would buy from third party at the time, let's say in the 80s, even out of like Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There's a company called Schwalm that was a big US manufacturer of dials. Sometimes Far East, sometimes in Europe. So companies specialize. You'd be amazed. There are the companies that only do watch hands. That's all.
Yes, but that's part of the Swiss manufacturing. The small. Okay, I'm only going to do index wheels. I'm only going to do mainsprings. I'm only going to do hands. I'm only going to do indices. And it's that cottage industry part of it that comes from the Swiss canton practice.
So I remember in BM, I used to go there to the factory. There would be these manufacturers that would just do these small components, dials, hands, crowns, and you're gonna know who to buy from for what.
Yeah, that's something else. I mean, looking at just the level of specification that comes from that aspect of the industry, and then when you think about a company like Citizen now, who is completely integrated to a great extent, movements, cases, dials, everything, not quite batteries, but close, that like they're able to produce all of the parts in-house and makes them a completely integrated. And now that Bulova is a part of that, it's such a change in the industry from when you started. And we don't think of 1980 as being that long ago, but it's kind of a while. That's a vintage car, man.
Yeah, no. So, back then it was a challenge. Sometimes maybe I call it a nightmare when you would have to order, if you're ordering 1,000 watches, you may order 1,050 cases. You may order 1,100 dials. You may order 1,150 hands because there's going to be some kind of fallout. And then after you've got everything assembled, some of those things will go for, later repair. But, you wind up with this sort of spoilage of things that are mismatched.
That's a fantastic conversation, though, because, okay, let's talk about that for a sec. When you are talking about a initial run of a watch design, whatever it may be, we're going to offer X amount of watches. And what would a typical run be? 1,000 pieces, 500 pieces?
Depends on the price point, but let's say that 1,000 was very common.
Okay, so 1,000 pieces. What was your overrun? How many extra cases? How many extra hands? How many extra dials?
We would have percentages for each. So sometimes it might be 3% overage, depending on who was making it and what the price point of that item might be.
No kidding.
The movement would be easier. You could, reuse the movements. The dials were very specific to a particular movement with the dial feet and the particular style. But I would also order on the initial run an extra amount for service for a number of years, that if we need an extra bracelet or extra links, we would have a standard size bracelet, let's say it's 7 inches or whatever. Then you would have extra links, and if they were tapered links, you'd have to adjust.
Right. The whole gamut.
It was somewhat of a science, but it was also an art to determine what the right amount was for that particular style. The straps also, when you have an integrated strap into the design, so it's not just a straight end piece. If it was integrated right into the design of the watch, you might order more of those, knowing that as that wears out, the consumer is going to want to replace that and have the original style that was intended.
Right, and won't have the ability to get an aftermarket strap because they weren't as common at the time.
Right.
Carl, I could kiss you right now. This is such a fantastic conversation. Everything about these are questions that I've had for years as I started to get into Bulova as a brand, but just understanding how watch brands specifically think. Because like the current iteration of Bulova is to do LE pieces at about 350, 500 to 1,000 pieces as a run. But I have been of the opinion that some of the vintage runs were probably not much higher than that, maybe 1,000 pieces, maybe less. And
but Bulova didn't do a lot of limited editions in the early years. There were some that they just manufactured, but they didn't necessarily declare that it was going to be a limited edition up front. I will tell you a story about I think it was a ambassador that I once did watch, where we wanted to do limited edition of 400.
Okay.
And someone from the Swiss office says, you can't do that because the number 4 is like the number 13 in America.
Yes, right. In Asian markets.
In Asian markets, people will not buy anything that has a 4 on. So obviously they wouldn't buy number 4 or 14 or 40 or whatever. But if you had one of 400, every single watch is going to have a 4 on it, because if you had a limited edition of 400. So we wound up making because we figured out how much we wanted to invest in this particular style. So we wound up doing a limited edition of 399.
There it is.
So we could do one of 399, two of 399, whatever. But also, counter to that, the number 8 is a very lucky number in Asian markets. So people would try to reserve number 8, number 88, 888, 18, whatever.
Right. It's such an interesting. So like we've talked about, and I mentioned it earlier, was the Oceanographer G, and there is a dial variation that does not have the 666 feet on that. And the supposition is that it's an Asian market because 6 is an unlucky number, and a variety of things that go along.
It's that 666 is an unlucky number.
Okay. Well, yes, of course.
So that was the issue. And then ultimately it became 200 meters, which is basically the equivalent, but without the baggage of having the sign of the devil on your wrist. But yes, sometimes I would say it's annoying to me that there are these different variations. Sometimes Oceanographer would be on the dial, but between the center post and the 6, sometimes it would be above. Sometimes Accutron is on the 9 side. Sometimes it's below, sometimes it's above, sometimes there's a tuning fork.
I'm gonna have to share with you my Oceanographer G dial spreadsheet, which has pictures and images, and I'll share that with you just so that my scholarship can become your scholarship, and between the two of us we can have a meeting of the minds. This is Carl. I am so happy. I don't know that I can express to you how happy I am that we are having this conversation. I have wanted to speak with you from the time that I learned that you were the person involved, and then learning about your history and your involvement with the brand, the fact that you might have some of the secrets that the collector community does not have access to, and not from any kind of oversight or any kind of any there's nothing nefarious about it. It's just the fact that we just don't have access to this, and the fact that you're able to speak with us and you're willing to speak with us. I love this to pieces. I am so happy.
Yeah. And anyway, I am happy that people are interested. And the intent originally was, Bulova was out there selling watches, and then it sort of morphed into a collectible, a legacy, a history. And so sometimes decisions would have been made differently if we knew that this was going to be, some of these details would be as important as, when looking back, they are.
So let's talk about that for a second. And it's this idea that Bulova, as a corporation, from its inception, did not really think about its history as a brand. Even going into Omar Bradley, going into the 1950s, that the idea that Bulova is a legacy brand maybe not really get its due until the 1970s, perhaps.
Yeah, although I think, for instance, when they did the first television commercial,
Okay,
they had done the first national radio commercial. And then there was an opportunity in New York, and something was going to be run. They wanted to be the first because they were the first in that medium.
yes.
They wanted to switch from radio to TV. So that probably was very conscious and very significant.
And just to be specific, that was a Brooklyn Dodgers commercial, correct?
It was a Brooklyn Dodgers, Philadelphia
Phillies.
Phillies.
As a Los Angeles adjacent person, the Los Angeles Dodgers, I just want to throw that out there and make sure that everyone understands that this is close to my heart. Okay.
July 1st, 1941.
Oh man, I am so happy. I am so happy
Actually,
right now.
I actually, if you're for our Brooklyn Dodgers in the archive, I also have pictures of the scoreboard, which is there's a Bulova advertisement on there, the Bulova clock on the scoreboard. I have pictures of Jackie Robinson in front of this scoreboard. So yeah,
everything about that is so fantastic. It's so fantastic. Can you talk, if we're talking about advertising, can you talk about the Sinatra collection? Because there is the Sinatra line, but Bulova sponsored his TV show for a number of years.
Right, like 1950 to 1952 or so. So it was also called the Bulova Hour. I mean, he was the entertainer of the times. I have in the archive, video of those shows and the commercials, and it's just great. We have maintained a relationship with the Sinatra family, and we have this relationship. So now we're producing Frank Sinatra watches. And what we've done is inspired the watches, not from specific designs, but from the categories of the watches that either he liked or were popular at the time.
I am a scholar and a collector of that era. And okay. I have my great grandfather's watch from the mid 50s. The size is different. However, the dial layout is identical. The structure of the watch is identical, and the aesthetic of the watch is identical, even bringing it to more modern proportions. And I think that's a fantastic level of the detail that goes into that. And I would love for you to speak to that.
So to me, what I always say is that for Bulova, every detail is a decision. So we know aesthetically how a dial and the markers and the hands work together. So what I did was work with the product development people. We looked at old styles, let's say from the 1940s and 1950s. We looked at the shapes of the cases. We looked at the different fonts. We looked at the different finishes on the dial. We looked at raised markers, just sort of what would have been popular. But we also wanted to make it commercially viable for today in terms of the size of the watches. So we used inspiration from all of those details to come up with something that would be representative of Frank Sinatra and sort of that New York sophistication. The one thing we did add was putting a fedora on the watch, so
At the
that
12 o'clock.
yeah, so it would be
It's a lovely touch.
it's a nice sophisticated touch, and the packaging is very nice.
It
We also
is.
did a rat pack,
Yes.
which the dial is sort of like a traditional vinyl record, feature. And we also paid attention to the case back, because these watches have to be designed on a 360 basis. It's not just buckle to buckle, but it's the front and the back. So, again, we wanted to make sure that everything was just the way it should be.
So speaking to your position as a historian, do you have a lot of input when it comes to the design when you're talking to?
I give feedback. I give history. Sometimes we'll even engage collectors. We will reach out to people that are strong collectors that have been collaborating with us. We say, here's some items we're thinking about. What do you think is the most representative, most iconic piece that we should reproduce? And actually, when we did the Chrono C, I think, and the Devil Diver, we actually reached out and had a vote, like
Yes.
which one should be the next one that we should do. So I provide the historical context. Sometimes I will source. So there was I should say, but I will. The Queen's Gambit.
Yes.
Okay, so in the Queen's Gambit, which was a great
Fantastic series, but the watch is excellent.
Okay, so here's the story, and here's how I came in. The watch in episode 4 or something like that was an American Girl. It was American Girl K, gold tone, and when there's an unboxing and the mother gives to the daughter, the chess master, her graduation gift from high school, and the girl opens it up, there's a Bulova box, and you can read Bulova from the screen.
Yes. Oh yeah, yeah. It's apparent.
He opens it up, and the mother goes, and it's a Bulova. Like, you should be impressed. So what happened was, Bulova had nothing to do with the product placement. They had no idea this was going to happen until it aired. And then
Really?
Yes.
No kidding. Okay. That, even with the Mad Men episode where it's okay, it's not a timepiece, it's a conversation piece.
We had nothing to do with that.
No kidding. Really?
Right. But on the flip side, Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, when they came to us and said we'd like her to wear a vintage authentic watch from the late 1950s, and I gave her a choice, she picked.
And that was you specifically?
Well, they came to the marketing department. The marketing department said to me, which ones would you pick? So I gave them a choice of 10. They picked one. And then at the end of the season, they returned the watch that she was wearing. And if you do remember the show, she comes down the Fontainebleau staircase and she looks at her wrist, and she's wearing the Bulova. But I want to get back to the Queen's Gambit. So after the show airs, then the phones are ringing off the hook. The trade press is calling, like, what's the watch? And so we actually recreated that. That was limited edition of 2,000 pieces.
Yes.
I found a collector that had that exact model. That they let me borrow that watch so that we could use the exact dimensions and reproduce it exactly as it was. It had been in the show. And Bulova said, well, let's do the box too. And I said, well, that is a legitimate Bulova box from that era, but that watch did not come in that box. So ultimately, we produced a different box. But these are the kinds of things that I sometimes get involved in. It may be after the fact rather than proactively.
But even that part of the story, the fact that you are available for that type of research, that type of interaction, because looking at it from a collector myself, and specifically, we talk about the Oceanographer G reissue. I remember the Analog Shift campaign, and there were three watches, and it was the chronograph A, it was the bullhead, and then it was the oceanographer G.
Right.
And I voted for the oceanographer G, even though I didn't own one at the time, but because I wanted the V, which was the orange dial iteration, and I knew that if they did the G, they would have to do the V, and hopefully it would be a limited edition, and all of the things that went with that. And I remember speaking out specifically on various forums about that, and then they did. And I've had conversations with Michael Benavente
Yeah.
about the fact that there's a difference between the pre-production version, which had the day date, versus the production version, which had the date only, and the fact that he has the day date, and he and I will discuss about that, and maybe there's an arm wrestling competition involved where I will end up with his watch, because I know that there's two versions of that I'm aware of, and so I'm trying to finagle my way into that particular watch.
Yeah,
But
I do want to give credit. I have a great archivist that works with me, Julie Loftus, and she's been with us since the beginning of the archive. And so she's great at research. She's a professional archivist, so we've set up an entire database with metadata where
isn't
I
that fantastic?
search across, so I can create stories. Um, across different models, across different years. And as we scan, we talked earlier with Mike, we scan with an OCR capability so that if there's a word that comes up in a document like an annual report, and I do a scan on the database, it will come up so that I know exactly where to look.
That's fantastic. Like the level of detail that you guys are able to be, even because you're trying to recreate this archive, which to me is even a more heroic endeavor based upon the fact that, like, most other brands, Longines, Rolex, Patek, AP, whoever you want to talk about, they've got this level of the archive. Bulova is recreating that archive, and my Bulova is a fantastic resource because they're looking at the advertisements. And the conversations that I've had is like, well, yes, you have this watch, however, it doesn't match into the advertisements that we have. It's like, well, okay, except I have the watch. It's like, yeah, but, and then use, okay, is it a Franken watch? Is it a recreation? Is
Right.
it this? Is it this?
We
And because Bulova was so competent when it came to dials and movements and cases and recombinations of those.
So one sort of funny story is the man that wrote the Boulevard Art Deco ladies' watches from 1922 to 1930. He did such research on all of the advertisements. He will even point out that the advertisement is wrong. This should be this name, and it's printed as that name. Whether or not it was an error on the Bulova side or on the printer side or on the newspaper side, I don't know. But
It's that, and that you bring up a fascinating point, that there is the difference between the official Bulova advertisement versus the independent retailer advertisement. I'm throwing this up in my local paper versus this is a Bulova advertisement within my local paper. And it's there's a difference between the two, and it's not something that people really talk about in terms of what is legitimate, what is not.
yeah. So yeah, just a couple of things on advertising. Bulovas started advertising in the Saturday Evening Post, and they were probably the most prolific advertiser in that publication. We have actually, mybulova.com actually has, I think, 72 different ads that Bulova ran over the years in the Saturday Evening Post.
Yes.
And from an advertising standpoint, Bulova also did a lot of edgy things. Some of it was a social statement, the equal pay, equal time.
Yes, I was going to say exactly.
It's amazing. I mean, it could probably run this year as well as it did in 1974, but it was a
Isn't
real,
that something?
yeah, it was a real statement. At that time, it was the height of, the Equal Rights Amendment
Yes.
initiation.
The ERA, women's rights movement, and the fact that Bulova was able to deal with that zeitgeist.
Yeah, I have an ad in French So I don't know if it was in France, but it may have been in Canada, which translates basically as a man and a woman were born as equal. Only one has a smaller wrist, and so it was the Bulova had watches for women as well as for men.
How lovely is that, though? As such a simple statement, but looking at an equity standpoint, that the ability for them to tap into an advertising agency that was as prevalent and as relevant, that's such a phenomenal statement for the company.
Yeah, that Equal Pay Equal Time was actually Doyle Dane, which was like the premier advertising agency of the time, probably around Mad Men, which we talked about that episode a little bit back.
All right, so we've talked about this a little bit as we've gone through our conversation today. Let's talk about the Corelli cases, because Bulova has just reissued that Marine Star. It's a tri-compax, but it's based on the Corelli case, which was an Italian market specific, and it was the first introduction of the Marine Star logo, for lack of a better time. Can you talk about that specifically?
Yeah. So as the story goes, Corelli was a Italian retailer, and they partnered with Zenith at the time, which was sort of independent. Not Zenith now is part of LVMH. And so the watches, I think, had a 7731 movement ETA Valjoux, and it was made for the military, the Italian military. And apparently more watches were produced than the Italian military was going to absorb. And Corelli either didn't pay for the cases. Anyway, there wound up to be surplus cases on the market. And Bulova took advantage of that. Bulova Italy took advantage of that. So they wound up taking the same case with the ETA movements and put a dial on it that said Bulova Marine Star. How they chose the name Bulova Marine Star, I really don't know. But as you know, around that era, Bulova was very well known for the dive watches, the oceanographer,
right,
things like that. So it was sort of a natural evolution, but it was very creative to put all of those red stars on the dial. And they came out with something that looked really like it was a takeoff on the Italian military watch, which is very popular.
It's a stunning watch design. And then when you start looking at the iterations of that, so you have the 2 register, and then you have the 3 register, and then you have the white dial and the black dial. And so then they move where the Marine Star logo is. But even with that, those watches are so fantastically collectible.
Yes, and I can't find one. I had one sort of slip through my fingers a bit, but I would love to have one for the archives. And
good Lord, you don't have one for the archives, really?
No, I borrowed one so that we could recreate it, but I don't own one. So if there's anybody out there,
all right. So okay, you've heard it here first.
Donate to the archive would be.
Bulova is looking for, if you have. So Mike and I, and we talk about this on a regular basis, and with this 150th anniversary, the watches that show up as the reissues, as the archive pieces, or as whatever, the American Girl, we did not predict. The mill ships, nobody predicted, and that was such a phenomenal release that it's like, it's not a reissue, it's an actual issue, because it was a prototype that had never, everything about that watch, and I own one and I love it. But this Corelli case and that Marine Star, I didn't see that coming at all. I had a whole laundry list of watches that could come before that. That was nowhere on my radar whatsoever. And I was so thrilled when we heard that was going to be a reissue. As like, and looking at it from what it's going to be from the design standpoint, from the everything about that watch, like, I love it.
But also, you got to give equal time to women too. The Miss America watch, I think, is stunning.
Okay, let's talk about that for a second, because the Miss America is a very specific model. I purchased for my wife a Miss Liberty, which is a slightly different model. However, the expansion bracelet on those watches is so exceptional, and the bracelet that's on the Miss America, it's the same bracelet, and the fact that Bulova decided to recreate that specifically, I was blown away, because we got the watch in, and I was missing a couple of links. I had the parts right next to the lugs, which had the jewel, but I had the clasp, but I didn't have enough links, and I was able to source that, and the filigree and the expansion. The fact that Bulova was able to recreate that blew me away. I didn't think that was coming at all. I didn't see that happening. That was nowhere on my bingo card at all.
I was skeptical that that filigree would be able to be done, especially the expansion links having that same filigree and that level of detail was amazing. When I have that watch in a showcase in the museum, I like to try to take it out, because I like to put it in people's hands and
You have to
pull that apart.
I did not recognize what it was until I actually got it, because you can't tell. Images don't show it. Nobody talks about it. And because it's a 1920s watch. It's 100 years old, if we're really putting it in perspective.
That one really is 1930. And actually, I have the original 1930 box and an original ad from 1930 for the Saturday Evening Post, where it has a picture of the watch in the box, and it says case and time at the Bulovas Observatory, which is 580 Fifth Avenue, New York. So I like to have this as a vignette where I have the watch in the original packaging and the ad that it appears.
Everything about that works for me. That watch, my wife loves it. When we go out and we have an evening out, that's the watch that she wears, because it is one of these. It's a party piece. The fact that the bracelet works as well as it does, the fact that the dial is as creamy as it has become, the movement and we've talked about this a little bit before. The movement is repairable today. It's 100-year-old movement. It's still able to be functional. And that's, to me, speaks to the ability of the Bulova company to be forward thinking.
Do you have that in the blue or the green? Or red?
We have it in the green.
Okay.
Ours is the green. Okay. And it's the 3 jewel.
America now is with the blue stones.
It's the blue stones. We have the green stones. There's also the red, and we don't have that one either. But that's okay. It's eminently collectible. I can still make some choices.
Actually, interesting. Bulova started the relationship with Miss America in 1927, and I have one of those original watches in the archive, and it's almost like a Southwestern. It was a sport model, and it wound up being, I think, the largest selling lady sport model in the country or the world at the time. But it's very, very different than the Art Deco piece from the 1930 or the Miss Liberty that you have.
Isn't that something else? But I love the fact that we're talking about a Bulovas ladies watch, because Bulova is known for a variety of other things. The ladies' watches are a little bit below what their history is.
In the Art Deco, if you understand that period, those watches were just magnificent. The other thing, when I give tours sometimes of the museum, people didn't realize we did pocket watches. And there's some magnificent pocket watches that were done over the years. And the early years too, for, let's say, Rubaiyat, we did Rubaiyat men's pocket watches. Also, before they decided to use the Bulova name on the product. There were other ones, Lord Springfield. There was the Phantom as a style.
There are even a number of Caravel Hunter style, which beautiful enamel dials that go with that. And the Vortic company, which I love to death. I have a couple of pocket watch movements, and I've considered getting a Bulova movement to have it recased, just to have that as a reference piece, to have the original Bulova pocket watch within a current wristwatch case, but trying to find the right hunter case in order to make sure that you have the crown at 3 versus at 12.
Actually, I was involved in. I have a watch I have here. See this watch?
I do. Okay.
It's a beautiful, beautiful dial, but it was originally a movement for a pocket.
Wow. Yeah.
So, this, when we launched this in Europe and Italy specifically, we made it an exhibition case back to show what that mechanical movement, was. But at the time, this was one of the first times you saw very large men's styles. Okay, so instead of creating a new movement, we just used a pocket watch movement, but put it in the wrist on a 40.
Of course, which is it's a fantastic thing, and you see that happening with a lot of other manufacturers. But the issue for me is the fact that Bulova has that history, and Bulova has a longevity, and there's like, of course you should do that. It makes perfect sense that you should do that. And when you talk about the pocket watch movement as it's a test movement for most watch schools. Build a pocket watch movement. It's simple enough. Build it from scratch. It's not a horrible, difficult thing. You don't need to do a to-10 escapement. You don't need to do all of these other aspects. It's a fantastic moment. And the fact that Bulova is able to still connect to that history, everything about that just appeals to me at a fundamental level, just from a brand standpoint. All right. Moving on to our last question.
Okay.
You ready? You sure? I can keep going. I've got layers here, but I know that your time is precious.
I have to have dinner.
Yeah, there you go. I have to cook. Okay. Let's talk about Marine Star. And so we've talked about the Corelli cases, but Marine Star, and you mentioned previously that was the first sort of collection, sub-brand, things that go along with that. Talk to me about Marine Star and how Marine Star got its start, because it is still an option today. It is still a line that is available today, even to the point that you have Fudgy the Whale on the case back of the current Marine Star logos.
Yeah, actually, talking about the whale in 70 era, they used to put the whale on the dial.
Yes.
To like the Sea Hunter or whatever, that they would it would really represent water resistancy if you had the whale on the dial. But anyway, in the United States, Marine Star started with that Corelli piece that we just talked about in Europe. And then in the 80s, as we started to reintroduce product after the acquisition by Lowe's, Marine Star was sort of a natural evolution. We knew about the piece in Europe. It was a name that we could use. It was representative of that history and legacy of dive watches or water resistant. And Bulova water resistant watches goes back to the 1930s. I think in 1930, they introduced the watertight, which was advertised by Johnny Weissmuller, the first Tarzan, but also he was an Olympic swimmer. So there was a whole history there. And they used that subdial, that logo with the stars and the Marine Star through it. It was very dynamic, recognizable, and really took off. So sort of the rest is history. As I said, it was huge in the Brazilian market, Marine Star. They almost considered Marine Star as a brand. And it was
that based upon the Corelli case, or was that based upon like the Sea King and the Clipper?
No, it was new pieces, new technology, new designs, new materials. I have some in my own personal collection that I like from that era. Um, and some of them were actually very small. If you look at today's standards, they were very
Oh,
small.
totally. So it's like 35, 34s. The version I have within my collection is it's the same movement as the Braille. It's that high torque.
Okay.
So no seconds hand, but it's a beautiful orange orange highlights on the hour markers. And
Yeah.
I love that watch because it wears so well. It's so thin and it's everything about it is just elegant and simple, but
Yeah.
still functional.
Yeah. And Bulova tried to sort of use advertising to expand the exposure for the brand. There's one great ad I have on display in one of the museums, which has a Marine Star, and we had a lot with blue or blue subdials, which looks great. And it was like a picture of a shark. But over the years, and still today, Marine Star is a core piece of the Bulova business. And it's, you know, dominantly male, but also female as well. And we also made sure that we designed watches that were not just smaller versions of the male version, but were designed as well for women. So that was important.
Everything about that though, and I've had conversations with female collectors and their issue and the conversation they've had with me is always about the shrink it and pink it. Make it smaller, throw some diamonds or make it pink, and throw a quartz movement in. And there's a watch that I want to give to the museum, which is a Bulova dive watch, ladies version, orange dial, automatic, quick set, internal cyclops, functional bezel. Everything about it is like it is not a shrink. It is a functional dive watch. It just happens to be small.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I have an Accutron that's the same way. I've got a Carabel that's the same way. And those are watches I would love to donate to any one of the museums that you have going on. And we'll talk about that in a second. Just the fact that Bulova was as a brand conscious of the female consumer and very cognizant, like the functionality of the watch matters. And it's not the fact that, okay, it's a lesser watch or it's not the same as the male brand. The female consumer is just as important to us as the male consumer. And I think that that's a fantastic aspect of the brand that has been lost a little bit in terms of the messaging or in terms of the history. And partially, not when we look at the advertising from the 70s, because the equal time for equal pay and the variety of other advertisements that come out from that era. But when we get into the 80s and the change in ownership, we lose a little bit. And I would really love for that to be brought more into prominence.
Yeah, but actually, is a challenge is sometimes when you have these sort of duets that work together. Let's say Marine Star. Oftentimes in a jewelry store, you will have a ladies' case and a men's case.
Yes.
And so, but these are watches that really should be merchandised together. And in some cultures, particularly Latin American cultures and Asian cultures, watches are often given as gifts as a pair for a wedding couple, let's say.
Yes. Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah. So, we always had the pressure that we should offer something that is both male and female that would be complementary design wise, that in essence, the male and the female would be wearing the same watch of the same concept that would bring them together, and it would be one gift for both of them. So anyway, some interesting things when you sort of work, especially in different cultures, that you've got to accommodate.
Okay, as my last question, and the last thing that we're going to talk about.
There was a last question.
No. I got one more. But this is specific to you. Bulova has the museum at the Empire State Building. There is a museum at the Citizen Flagship Store. There is going to be a traveling museum that is going to be able to go nationally. And then there is going to be a museum at the North American Watch Association, right?
Yes.
What is your involvement in that? Can you speak to those different
Okay. I'm
installments?
involved in all of those. Um, so actually, when we talk about the Empire State Building and the flagship store, I don't think I can think of a brand in any category that has two museums on the same street in the same city. Okay, so one. We did open at the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. That museum is now open, and that is open to the public, and it's beautiful. It's very professional. It is a full museum experience. We have, besides the watches and memorabilia, and I even have a Bulova telescope that was on a tank in World War II. I have a Bulova fuse that was probably made in the Lancaster area that would go into an ordnance device there. And I have 8 monitors that have like rotating content because you can't showcase everything in a small little vitrine. So we try to
Of
tell
course.
we tell some stories, we have some videos, we have some old commercials. So I encourage that's in Columbia, Maryland, just outside of Lancaster. It's part of the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors facility. It's the largest watch and clock museum in the United States, and it's worth seeing not just for the Bulova exhibit, but for the rest.
So we'll talk offline. I have some things I would like to donate. We'll discuss that. But all of that aside, I appreciate you taking the time. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to speak with us, speak with Michael and myself, speak about the Bulova history and your position as a historian. Is there if people have things that they would like to donate to the museum or they'd like to give to Bulova specifically, how can they get in touch? What can they do?
I wish I could have an email address that I would give to the public, but you can contact customer service at Bulova, and they find me.
There you go. That's perfect.
But we appreciate that. I do want to say we can't take everything. Sometimes it's costly for us not only to store some things that I have to store in temperature and humidity controlled environments so that it doesn't deteriorate. I have to catalog it, so it's an expensive ordeal, but it's for the pieces that we don't have, and sometimes we want duplicates because we have a traveling museum, we have these other locations. We want to make sure that this is accessible to people who can appreciate it. So please contact us, let us know. And we also want to know the stories behind it. If it was something that belonged to your father, your grandfather, you got as a particular gift, it's not just about the items, it's about the stories behind them that we want to look and record.
Carl, thank you so much. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Thank you so much for taking the time to explain the Bulova history and to be a part of our record of what we have going on, which I know is part of your record of what's happening. And so from the bottom of my heart, and I speak for Mike as well, thank you so much.
And thank you. Thank you for everything that you do at Spring Bar. And we appreciate it and appreciate all the interest in the brand and continuing the legacy.
Cheers.
Cheers.